welcome to the podcast series, News Take Free Press Focus. I'm Charlotte McBurney with the News Media Alliance, and I'm your host of this series designed to explore pressing issues related to the free press and the First Amendment. On today's episode, we dive into the topic of reporter shield laws. We will hear firsthand from Eric Meyer, owner of the Marion County Record in Kansas, who will share his account of the day his newsroom was raided by police and how it impacted his newspaper in the local community. Also in today's episode, we have Gabe Rottman from the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. Gabe directs the Technology and Press Freedom Project at the Reporters Committee and is an expert on the topic of reporter shield laws. Together, we'll discuss how the Marion County raid sparked conversations about the importance of reporter shield laws and also calls for Congress to pass the Press Act, a bipartisan bill that would provide a reporter shield law at the federal level. Welcome, Eric and Gabe. Thank you for being part of the conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Eric, I'm going to start with some questions for you, if I may. So I'm curious, what do you see as your role and responsibility as a local newspaper to the community? And if I'm correct, I understand that Marion County Record is the only publication covering Marion? Is that right?
The city of Marion, yes. There's another free publication that's distributed in the county, but it doesn't really cover news. It does a few things. And we technically have three papers that are printing as one. They have been since COVID. So we're basically it. We're what's keeping us from being a news desert. But the role of journalism, particularly community journalism, has changed a bit over the years. It used to be that a lot of community journalism products were hometown boosters. They were the Chamber of Commerce, how wonderful it is to live here, that type of thing. Well, that social media pretty well does that sort of stuff. So our job is more like that of traditional journalism, of being a watchdog, of providing information, particularly in an era in which government is becoming far less transparent than it ever was in the past. So our job is to find the information so that people can make informed decisions about what they want to do and hopefully engage the public. Public engagement is at an all-time low as far as I'm concerned. And that gives rise to a lot of sloganeering and hot button issues and sort of the problem we see all around the country these days.
Well, it's an extremely important role, and we're definitely glad you're doing your part for the community. So the Marion County Record sprang into the national news in August of 2023 for a pretty unusual reason. Your newsroom was raided by police. So I want to ask, I'm sure everyone's curious who may not know already, why did police raid your newsroom, and did it come as a complete surprise to you?
Well, the raid came as a complete surprise. I should have known it was coming because the relationship between local government and the newspaper was deteriorating rapidly over the course of several months. We kept reporting things that they didn't want us to report, and the vitriol of the response of some of the people just kept rising. And it was not just us that was raided. It was also a political opponent of the mayor who was raided at the same time. This was all about us checking a document that had been leaked to us. We checked it. We checked it with a driver's license website. We actually had the help of the people who run the website to get us the record. And they've publicly said later that it's a public record and anybody can get it. So we aren't quite sure why we were raided, other than the fact that it was a good opportunity to do something to kind of slap us into our position. The same thing with the vice mayor, whose house was also raided. She'd even given them a copy of the document that they had and told them who it came from. They knew where it came from, how we got it, how she got it, and they knew that all we had done was attempted to verify it. We didn't want to be Dan Rathered and have a document in our possession that was fake and try to act on it. We had, however, decided we weren't going to use the document, and we told the police that and offered to cooperate with them. They never talked back to that. They just saw this as an opportunity for a gotcha and came to us and raided us. And not just a simple raid. They were proud of the fact that this was the biggest raid in the history of Marion County. For an identity theft case, even if it had been a legitimate case, why would that be the biggest raid in the history of the county? They spent 2.5 hours at my mother's home with 7 police officers. 98-year-old woman, her name was Joanne. I think they may have thought her name was Joanne Dillinger instead of Joanne Meyer. But 7 of them to try to seize her computer. And then afterward, they thought about trying to arrest her for interfering with law enforcement because she approached them with her walker, and they thought she was trying to attack them with her walker. This was just, it was a classic example of bullying. Getting to the relationship of the police chief, who was motivated by the fact that we had information on him that said that he probably wasn't suited for the job. He was brand new. He had just come here from Kansas City, where he was a captain earning $120,000 a year, to go to Marion earning $60,000 a year. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, except we had information that we hadn't been able to publish because we couldn't get on the record sources indicating improprieties. He was about to be demoted in Kansas City and so on. So they discovered that in this raid, where they were supposed to be looking for identity theft things. The mayor had been trying to get rid of the vice mayor, and he tried to recall her. He'd tried a whole bunch of other things, and he'd come to the conclusion that the only way he could get her was if she was convicted of some crime. So they concocted this story that we had stolen this woman's identity, and we had done it and sent it to the vice mayor, which is not true. And they wanted to raid our houses and get us both at one time. They linked us quite often because we reported most of the things that she raised as concerns, which there's quite a history of, going back to an attempt by the mayor to put through a charter ordinance which overrules state law that would have eliminated the right of people in the community to vote on bond issues. And she led an overturn effort of that. And that's when things got really hot.
Well, gosh, that's an incredible story. I'm so sorry you had to go through all of that. And also, as I understand it, you lost your mother shortly after the raid. I'm terribly sorry to hear that. Yeah,
the raid was very distressing to her. She had worked for this newspaper for close to 60 years, still was working for it. At age 98, she did the old time memories column for us every week. It's not very often that you find somebody with a microfilm viewer in their living room, but she had one, and she would go through and pick these old memory things out of the newspaper once a week. But she'd retired to do just that one day a week. She'd prior to that been a copy editor, community news editor, and so on. She felt like her whole life was worthless because of this, that after 98 years that people were able to just come in and do this to her home. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't drink, she wouldn't go to bed. She was very upset after this raid, during which she had said several times to the officers, "This is going to be the death of me. You're going to give me a stroke or a heart attack and I'm going to die." And she finally went to bed around 6 or 7 in the morning, and I let her sleep till afternoon. She woke up, she went to the bathroom, she came back to her bed, and I said, you really should eat something. You haven't eaten anything since Thursday. It's Saturday. And I said, do you want me to bring some breakfast into you in the bedroom? Do you want to go to the kitchen? Do you want to eat at the bar in the family room? She says, I don't know. I don't feel to, and died right in the middle of that sentence.
Gosh.
Sudden cardiac arrest. I understand it's something called broken heart syndrome. It's not uncommon among the elderly, that if they feel that their whole life, their whole existence, what they stood for doesn't matter anymore, that they just kind of give up and go away.
That's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that, and what a completely unnecessary tragedy.
Yeah.
It's part of
well, the nice thing about it, honestly, is, and she would think this way, when you're 98 years old, you know it's coming sometime soon. And it's pretty rare for a 98-year-old to be able to go out making a statement. I mean, she made a statement. She was the face of this raid. and I think she'd appreciate that, and she did not go gentle into that good night.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Gabe, how did you first learn of what happened at the Marion County Record, and what was your immediate reaction?
I was actually out with friends, and the story started to make the rounds. I mean, I think that the search had had happened on a Friday, a bit earlier in the day, but it kind of just happened. And I think that the Kansas Reflector had reported on it, and it started to go a bit viral. And we saw it, and immediately knew that it was pretty exceptional case, and exceptionally troubling. We immediately kind of circulated internally at the reporters committee, talked about what we needed to do. We knew we kind of had to jump on things right away. I got back to a computer. We, right then started drafting a letter of concern that national news organizations could join, and started reaching out to contacts, locally, including Bernie Rhodes, who was able to represent the record, and Eric, and sort of we went from there. But the thing that was immediately apparent, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, is that newsroom searches, newsroom raids are exceedingly rare. They happen kind of once in a blue moon, which is a good thing. They really shouldn't happen at all. They're the most intrusive. They're the most intrusive step that law enforcement can take with respect to a news organization. In part because when you execute a search warrant and then seize material, particularly when you're talking about electronic devices, you're getting everything. You're getting all of the paper sources potentially. You're getting all of the unpublished material, and so there's a federal law that's supposed to keep it from happening, and also just I think law enforcement is aware that there are less intrusive means to conduct investigations, and so they don't really happen that often. And when they do, they're a very big deal, as this ended up being.
And it's important to note that they didn't just search our newsroom. They took our stuff. They took all of our computers. They made a copy of our server. But they didn't really do much of a search. Right here on my desk, sitting right there, was the document that we had obtained. They didn't take it. It was under another piece of paper, but they didn't look at it. But they looked through drawers of a reporter who hadn't even been there the week that we got the document, and found the research we'd done on the police chief. They found that and pointed it out to the police chief. And then they took all of our computers. We didn't even have, the nameplate at the top of the front page that says Marion County Record, because they took all of our computers that were used for news. They took our file server. They took our backup hard drives. We had a backup that was on Blu-ray discs, but they took all the computers that had Blu-ray players in them. So we had to recreate basically everything to continue publishing. And we didn't get that material back till after our next publication deadline. So it almost seemed like they were intentionally trying to keep us from publishing.
Wow.
And they didn't have any reason to take the material that they did. They did a preliminary search on it, but they searched for such bizarre terms. They searched for the word Kansas. Well, they found, thousands of files that had the word Kansas in it. They searched for DOR, for the Department of Revenue, which is where the record was. But they didn't search for it as a word or as an abbreviation. So any word that had the letters DOR in the middle of it showed up on their search. So they got a wonderful ad for the movie Finding Dory, and things of that nature that showed up in their search. And then when they said, their search warrant said you're supposed to search the thing and decide what's been used and you can seize that, they decided to just seize everything because they couldn't find anything in the search.
Wow, it's incredible. We were shocked as well, obviously, at the News Media Alliance when we heard of this, and we were proud to join the letter that you, Gabe, at Reporters Committee joined in condemning the raid, and demanding that the equipment is returned as soon as possible and an investigation is done. speaking of that seizure of equipment, Eric, how did you go to print? Because you went to print a few days later. I mean, with all the interruptions, how did you manage that? And I guess why was it so important to you and the team to still go to print?
It was 2 all-nighters for one thing in a row, but we also went to what I could call euphemistically our storage room, which is also referred to as our junk room. And we found a whole bunch of old computers that were like old Windows XP computers, and we created a new network off of them and created a new temporary file server. And fortunately, I'm a fairly technologically savvy person because I taught this in college before I retired. We were able to do it. We got a paper out. We screwed up in that paper. We forgot a whole half-page ad. There was a lot of things that were wrong about that paper, but we got it out, and there was no way we weren't going to get it out. I don't care if we had to, hand write it on pieces of paper and run them through a photocopier somewhere. We were going to have a newspaper, one way or the other.
It's really admirable that you were able to do that. And so, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, but the equipment was eventually returned, as I understand it.
It was returned about 2 hours after our paper hit the streets. And then it went in. Bernie Rhodes, who he mentioned previously, our attorney, had arranged for some forensic experts to see whether they'd done anything to our computers. And they had them for about a week after that. But by that time, we'd set up our temporary system, so it worked for another week or so. And then we got them back. There was a big dispute over the copy of our hard drive that they took. They didn't want to return it. Finally, a judge said, "You didn't understand my order. I said return it. Don't mess with this." And they finally said they couldn't return it because they had copyright programs that were owned by the FBI, which, by the way, is a lie because the program they were using, we found out, is in public domain. But they destroyed the drive rather than give it back to us, so that we have a little bag that's full of pieces of a hard drive that they destroyed, and we have to take it at their word that they didn't look at anything on our computers during the time that they had them. They had them just at the county jail, just a block across the street from us here, and the only thing we've heard from one officer is that no one did meaningful inspection of them. So we don't know what that means.
Wow, gosh. So Gabe, you touched on this a little bit earlier, saying that we don't see these kinds of raids too often in the US, thank goodness. And similarly, we don't see too often reporters being sort of pressured by government officials to turn over documents or confidential sources. Why is that? What sets the US apart? Why is this so rare and then so shocking when it happens?
Yeah, there's actually kind of an interesting history behind it. Back in the early 1970s, there was a Supreme Court case called Zurcher v. Stanford Daily, and the basic facts were there was a protest on the Stanford campus, and the police suspected that there may have been photographs taken by the paper that captured images of folks who were of interest in investigating what had happened, and the campus police executed a search warrant where they seized news gathering materials from the Stanford Daily. But the court, found in that case in favor of that the search was constitutional, which was very controversial. And Congress started discussing and deliberating over legislation that would overturn that Zurcher case by statute. So in other words, it would and potentially would bar law enforcement from using search warrants to search for mere evidence when the person being searched or the entity being searched wasn't suspected of a crime. And that ultimately resulted in a statute that was limited to First Amendment activity that was actually supported by the Justice Department at the time. And that ended up being what's called the Privacy Protection Act of 1980, which establishes which creates protections creates protections that apply to law enforcement at all levels of government. So it's not just federal law enforcement, but the PPA applies to federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement, and when law enforcement's trying to use a search warrant to search for what's called work product material, so basically anything that has the mental impressions of a reporter, they really can't do it unless they suspect the reporter or the news organization of having committed a crime. It's what's called the suspect exception. And if they're searching for anything else, what's called documentary material, and you can think of that as, photographs or pieces of paper or documents that have been collected by the news organization, there's a subpoena first requirement. So in other words, if law enforcement wants to get that stuff, they really need to use a subpoena. And the reason why a subpoena is more protective of the news organization and First Amendment interests than a search warrant is that a search warrant, as here, you just go in and take everything. A subpoena, you hand it over, and then you can negotiate over the scope of the subpoena. And if you need to, you can go to court and try and block enforcement of the subpoena. And so that's a long and overly legal answer. But the long and short of it is that there is federal law in place that is supposed to prevent newsroom raids, and it does a pretty good job. Again, these things are really few and far between. And then there's also at a federal level, the Justice Department itself has policies in place that currently, after being revised in 2022, would preclude the use of a search warrant in this manner for journalists engaged in the scope or who are acting within the scope of news gathering, quote unquote, within the scope of news gathering. And many states also have protections in place that would limit the ability of law enforcement to use a search warrant to basically raid the newsroom and seize news gathering materials. There are both legal protections in place, and then there's also the understanding that when these things happen, they end up being pretty significant national stories. They generate a lot of public concern and outcry. And in many cases, the way that law enforcement will interact with news organizations is they'll talk to one another and try and figure out what they're trying to do in a mutually acceptable way that doesn't trench on First Amendment interests.
Absolutely. And then relatedly, I believe you may have touched on this, states have what we call reporter shield laws or reporter privileges. And for our audience, those are laws that protect reporters from being forced to reveal their confidential sources or having to testify in court. Now, while almost every state has some form of a shield law, we don't have one at the federal level. And Gabe, I guess, can you explain to us briefly why that is important to have a federal reporter shield law? Why are we lacking it, and what can we do about that?
So it's interesting. So exactly. So virtually all states either have a law in the books, a statute that provides some protections from journalists from having to disclose the identities of their confidential sources or have to turn over their work product or their news gathering material. And then the states that don't have a statute, the courts have recognized some form of federal reporter privilege. At the federal level, it goes back to a case from the early 1970s called Brainsburg, where the Supreme Court said there's no general reporter's privilege specifically with respect to criminal grand jury subpoenas. And so as a result of that case, there's been some uncertainty in terms of whether the federal courts would recognize reporters' privilege. Some do, some don't. But Congress has never spoken on the matter. And so, again, there is that uncertainty. And so at a federal level, the main protection are those policies that I mentioned at the Justice Department that limit the ability of, particularly the Justice Department prosecutors and investigators to use search warrants or subpoenas to get information from the press. But the key thing is that that's a Department of Justice policy. It can be changed by subsequent administrations. And it's really important that Congress finally step into that breach and pass a federal law that provides certainty across the country at a federal level on the scope of a reporter's privilege and how it works. Right now, there's the Press Act pending in Congress, the Protecting Reporters from Exploitative State Spying Act, which is both the strongest reporter shield law that's been introduced to date. It has a really helpful and functional definition of journalist, for instance, and it has very narrow exceptions, for instance, to prevent an act of terrorism against the United States or identify a perpetrator. And it also has significant bipartisan support. So the bill is co-sponsored in the Senate by Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, and Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah. And it also has as co-sponsors Senators Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, who's the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, who's the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. So, we're hopeful that while everybody recognizes that passage of a federal shield law has always been a bit of an uphill climb, there's some movement around it, in this Congress, and particularly given the possibility that the current DOJ guidelines could change after the November election, it's really urgent that law pass this Congress.
So News Media Alliance have been long supporting the Press Act, and we definitely hope it passes. Our members find it really important to have a federal reporter shield law, because if you have a reporter speaking to a confidential source and they ask, can you keep my identity confidential? Right now, a reporter can do that on the state level if there's an investigation or prosecution, but they can't promise that on the federal level. So we definitely need those protections, because that uncertainty breeds silence, and it's less likely that a source is going to come forward and provide valuable information to the public if they don't know that they have that protection. So
it also puts the reporter in a terrible position, because the reporter may promise confidentiality and then be forced by the government to reveal the source, and then could be sued by the source for breach of contract. So you can either go to prison for contempt of court, or you can be sued for breach of contract. You have no middle ground. It's a lose-lose situation.
Absolutely, and we're seeing that currently, actually, with the case of the reporter Catherine Herridge, former Fox News and CBS reporter, who's been held in civil contempt for refusing to turn over her confidential sources. So it's a very real problem for reporters to this day, and we're certainly hopeful that the Senate will pass the Press Act, and reporters will get this much needed protection. So, Eric, I want to give you the last word on this. You've gone through a lot's happened. Is there a silver lining or something positive that's come out of this for you or with the community? And what do you hope that this will bring going forward?
Well, first of all, I endorse everything about seeking greater legal protections. But one of the things I would point out is really the legal protections that were there should have been adequate to prevent this. This is a case of government overreach. And in some cases, as much as I would like to say it's all a First Amendment issue, it's a Fourth Amendment issue. There really wasn't a point to any of these searches that they were going on with. And government is getting kind of surly in these regards. And part of it is because there hasn't been as much good, they feel that the press is weakened and that they can attack it at any given time. The nice thing about it is the outpouring of support we've received from all over the country, from people of all political viewpoints. I was going through, we got 10,000 emails. Not a single one of them was opposed to us. And I remember going through them and going to one of them, and it says, must be those damn Democrats that did it. And I hit the next button and it says, must be those damn Republicans that did it. It's coming from all corners of the political spectrum, and disproportionately we've been hearing from law enforcement officers, people who have retired from the law enforcement community, who say how how wrong this was. I think they're getting tired of being bashed around by the misdeeds of others. But there is an attempt to not only pull the veil of secrecy around government operations, but to also weaponize the law enforcement community against anyone who dares to challenge that veil. And that is a serious problem. The good news is there are a lot of people out there who seem to recognize it and won't put up with it. Now they just have to come forward and make sure this doesn't happen.
Well, let's all hope that it does not happen again, and we move on from this in a positive way and legislate some stronger protections and that those protect reporters going forward. So Eric and Gabe, thank you so much for being part of this important conversation today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, if you have any thoughts or comments, please reach out to me at charlotte@newsmediaalliance.org. And please subscribe to our podcast and share it with a friend or colleague. You can find us on the major podcasts, apps, YouTube, and our website, newsmediaalliance.org. Thank you again to my guests, Eric Meyer and Gabe Rottman, and to our listeners. See you all on the next episode of News Take Free Press Focus.